Welcome to All That's Left, a podcast from Left Voice. After a summer break, we are back in your app and in your ear canals, and we've got lots of great socialist content coming down the pipeline in the coming months. Our topic today is the election in Brazil. Brazil is holding general elections on Sunday, October 2nd, and they're being watched closely around the world. The current president, the right-wing Jair Bolsonaro, is running for a second term, but is trailing behind his opponent, who is former president Luiz Inácio Lula da Silva, or Lula, as he's commonly known. This election is predicted to go to a runoff round unless one of the candidates gets at least 50% of the vote. Bolsonaro and his supporters have taken a page out of Donald Trump's playbook, and they've already started to discredit the election process and basically lay the groundwork for disputing the results, which, like I mentioned, so far point to a victory for Lula. At a meeting with Brazilian evangelical leaders, Bolsonaro even said, quote, "I have three alternatives for my future: being arrested, killed, or victory." Bolsonaro's presidency has been absolutely disastrous on many fronts. For the working class, for Brazil's poorest sectors, for oppressed people, for indigenous people, and for the environment. He is openly racist and homophobic and misogynistic, and unsurprisingly, he's a close ally of Donald Trump. He openly supports the former Brazilian dictatorship. He's implemented austerity, wide-scale privatization, and policies that are highly favorable to imperialists and to Brazilian capitalists. And his policies have been absolutely devastating for the environment, particularly for the Amazon. Bolsonaro is also a COVID denier and a vaccine skeptic, and he fought hard to keep the Brazilian economy open and to prevent things like mask mandates. As a result of his mismanagement of the pandemic, around 700,000 people in Brazil have died of COVID-19, which is one of the world's highest death tolls after the United States. But Bolsonaro's presidency, his rise, and the rise of the right in Brazil more broadly can't be seen in a vacuum or just as an aberration. We also can't only blame the institutional coup that brought down former President Dilma Rousseff, nor can we blame the maneuvers that led to Lula's impeachment in 2018, even though, as our guest will describe today, these were really consequential events. The broader context that's more important to understand here, and that we'll try to cover more in future episodes, is that Jair Bolsonaro was elected during a right-wing wave in Latin America that followed over a decade of center-left governments that were part of the so-called Pink Tide. This was a time when Brazil was led by the Workers' Party, or the PT, under Lula and then Dilma. In addition to Bolsonaro, during this time, the subsequent conservative governments in Latin America included figures like Mauricio Macri in Argentina and Sebastián Piñera in Chile. The rise of the right, of course, in Latin America also coincided with other right-wing phenomena across the world that we're very familiar with, like the election of Donald Trump, the victory of right-wing parties in Europe, and Brexit in the UK. So, in Brazil, it's clear that the so-called progressive PT governments helped pave the way for the rise of Bolsonaro through their attacks on the working class, their neoliberal policies, and through their repression of popular and social movements. In other words, despite their progressive nature, Pink Tide governments like those under the PT fundamentally did not alter or challenge the pillars of capitalism and imperialism. At the same time, despite all this, many leftists internationally, like here in the US, have placed their hopes in Lula and the PT, and they have a very positive view of the party's legacy. This is despite the fact that Lula has actually already been pretty open about the fact that he won't roll back many of Bolsonaro's policies, like his privatization, And Lula also is definitely no enemy of Brazilian capitalism and Brazil's institutions. Today on the podcast, I am joined again by Left Voice member Rob Belano to talk about these topics. We'll discuss Jair Bolsonaro's rise and his legacy, what a Lula presidency would look like, and what the tasks are for the Brazilian and the international left going forward. Before we start, I also want to give a very big thank you to Danilo Paris from Esquerda Diario, our sister site in Brazil, and to Daniel Alfonso, who is a member of Left Voice. They both provided a lot of help in putting together this episode. Rob, welcome back to the podcast.
Thanks for having me back.
Yeah, no, super great to have you here. So we're recording this just a few days away from Brazil's general election, and Jair Bolsonaro's first and perhaps only presidential term will come to a close this year. We've heard a lot about him, even all the way here in the US. He's been a pretty provocative figure in the past 4 years, to say the least. He made international headlines pretty much during his whole presidency for things like his really intense pandemic denialism, his racist, sexist, homophobic comments, his encouragement of deforestation in the Brazilian Amazon, and for the fact that he is a close ally of Donald Trump. In fact, a lot of people have called him basically Brazil's Trump. Could you start by maybe describing Jair Bolsonaro's legacy?
Sure. So to begin, Bolsonaro took office at the peak of this reactionary wave that occurred around 2018 and took place really across South America and throughout the world in many ways. And this, of course, followed approximately a decade and a half of the center-left pink tide governments on the subcontinent. And of course, the pink tide governments were administrations that enacted some moderate reforms during times of economic boom, but really failed to make any structural changes. And so this new right-wing wave included Bolsonaro, of course, also the election of multimillionaire business magnate Mauricio Macri in Argentina. It included a civic and military coup against Evo Morales in Bolivia that installed Janine Áñez. And all of this, of course, coincided with other far-right phenomena like the surprising victory of Donald Trump in the United States and the success of Brexit in the UK. And Bolsonaro really drew his support from the military, from the big bourgeoisie, from agribusiness, evangelicals, the Trump administration. And as you say, similar to Trump, he used a very racist, misogynist, homophobic rhetoric that helped create a popular base for him among reactionary sectors of society. And, just made the most incendiary, racist remarks imaginable, including praising the U.S. cavalry for their slaughter of indigenous people. His vice president talked about the need to rid Brazil of its African heritage. And of course, this rhetoric is not completely new. The Brazilian capitalist class has long benefited from subordinating Black people, Black workers, who, like in the United States, receive lower wages, fewer benefits, fewer job protections. And so racism in Brazil solidifies the position of Black workers as a super exploited sector. As you say, like Trump, Bolsonaro was a coronavirus denialist and bears chief responsibility for the nearly 700,000 COVID deaths to date in the country. From the beginning, he dismissed any attempts to contain the pandemic as hysteria. He called for Brazilians to resist quarantine measures and organize massive public rallies in favor of opening the economy. Um, he infamously forced two successive health ministers to resign and finally replaced them with a uh, military general with absolutely no public health experience. And it was this denialist position that ultimately was responsible for isolating Bolsonaro internationally, along with turning sections of the middle class and even the bourgeoisie against him. From the standpoint of climate, Bolsonaro's agenda, I think we can say easily represents one of the biggest threats that there is. He's openly encouraged the raising of forests in the Amazon, which are the largest terrestrial carbon sinks in the world, sequestering um, uh, uh, more carbon than any other landmass on the planet, and one of the most important defenses that the planet has against global warming. And so Bolsonaro is a president who calls himself Captain Chainsaw for his eagerness to clear forests and rejects any laws protecting forests or the lands of indigenous people. Um, Numerous records for forest fires were set during Bolsonaro's 4 years in office, and most of the fires were deliberately set with the objective of clearing land for agricultural or mining activity. And that's something that Bolsonaro himself was forced to admit in 2019. So we can say, I think, without hyperbole, that Bolsonaro represents a enormous threat not just to the Brazilian people, but to the entire planet. On the other hand, Lula, who has always sought to compromise with big business and the center right, who have no intention of enacting meaningful environmental protections, really offers us no way out either.
Yeah, I mean, Bolsonaro's legacy is really striking, and I'm especially struck by how open he is about being basically such an abhorrent figure. I mean, his open callousness when it comes to like his views on the environment, on oppressed minorities, on the coronavirus are all really, really shocking. But something I wanted to highlight in the introduction to this episode is that Bolsonaro's rise, like the rise of other right wing forces and phenomena, didn't happen just kind of like out of the blue in a vacuum. So before we get to Lula and the elections, I want to set the context a little bit more and talk about Brazil before Bolsonaro. How was it possible for someone like Jair Bolsonaro to win the election in 2018?
Well, I think we can say to begin that the election of Bolsonaro in 2018 would never have been possible without a series of highly anti democratic measures undertaken by the Brazilian ruling class. So these included the institutional coup d'etat against President Dilma Rousseff of the PT in 2016, which was an entirely politically motivated process. It was the outcome of the so-called Lava Jato, or Operation Car Wash investigation, which was led by Sergio Moro. Again, a right-wing figure who later became a minister in Bolsonaro's government. So this was a totally fraudulent process that had nothing to do with combating corruption or abuse of power, but rather instilling a government that was able to carry austerity measures even further, and enact even more counter reforms against the working class. And we should note too that Lava Jato and the institutional coup were supported by the United States under Obama. They were carried out, in cooperation with the U.S. Department of Justice. And prior to the 2018 elections, in which Bolsonaro was victorious, Lula, who was the most popular candidate at the time, was jailed on a totally illegitimate and politically motivated basis. And so this prevented him from standing for the presidency at a time when he likely would have defeated Bolsonaro. But I think it's also important to point out that, this balance of power in which the institutional coup, in which Operation Car Wash were possible, was because of the severe erosion of popular support for the PT governments as a result of their, policies over the approximately decade and a half in which they were in government. I think most notably was the massive demonstrations in 2013, in which hundreds of thousands of people poured into the streets to demonstrate against the increased bus fares imposed by the mayor of the city of Sao Paulo, Fernando Haddad, of the PT. And we should also say, of course, that these hikes in bus fares were also supported by the governor of the state of Sao Paulo, who was at the time Gerardo Alckmin, now Lula's pick for vice president. And Alckmin was responsible for all sorts of police and military repression of demonstrators at the time. And so these mobilizations, which really took place across the entire country, involving hundreds of thousands of people, began to question Brazil's rising poverty, the increased cost of living, all at a time when the government of Dilma Rousseff was spending billions to host the FIFA Confederations Cup, which was in 2013, and then the World Cup the year after. And so while it was necessary for those on the left to reject the anti-democratic persecution of Dilma and Lula by the judiciary, we should be clear that it was their policies that paved the way for the political crisis of 2016, which ended with Rousseff's impeachment and Lula's imprisonment.
Yeah, so let's actually go into a little bit more depth about Lula and Dilma Rousseff, who have really been hovering over this conversation so far like a specter, and they really hang over the upcoming election. Because, like I said earlier, Lula is really favored to win this election, even though he's probably going to face a runoff round with Bolsonaro. What's really interesting, though, is that a lot of leftists, like, for example, members of the DSA, the Democratic Socialists of America, have really placed their hopes in Lula and in the PT. In fact, something we wrote about was that Dilma Rousseff of the PT was actually one of the keynote speakers of a DSA 2021 convention, even though, as we wrote at the time when we described her administration, her government represented a strong rightward turn in Brazil, and she presided over attacks on the working class. So I guess I'd love to hear a little bit more about what Lula and Dilma's legacies were And what does that tell us about what another Lula presidency would look like?
Yeah, so I think to begin, we can take a look at the first two terms of Lula uh, and the Dilma Rousseff presidency that followed them. And I think these will give us some good insights into what a new Lula presidency will be. So, Lula's first government, which began in 2003, is one that we could characterize as a preventative popular front. And by that, um, I mean that it included workers' representatives. Lula himself was a well known trade union leader, but also representatives of the big bourgeoisie. The PT governed early on in a coalition with various parties and figures from the center and even the center of right, many of whom would go on to support the institutional coup against Rousseff eventually in 2016. And Lula's first cabinet contained various representatives of big business and the banks and landowners, in addition to the unions and workers' movements, etc. And so, in this way, this government of Lula's shared many similarities with the Popular Front governments that governed in France and Spain in the 1930s, and like them, served as a way of containing the popular movements. Now, in France and Spain, these were revolutionary movements. Um, we can't exactly say that in Brazil there were revolutionary movements taking place, and so this is why we say preventative popular front. But there were major expressions of resistance to neoliberalism in the 1990s and the early 2000s, both in Brazil and throughout South America, that really caused concern for the ruling class. In Brazil, for example, there was the landless peasants movement, known as the MST, which occupied the latifundios, the large estates, and demanded land reform. In Argentina, during the December days of 2001, there were major mobilizations of poor people, students, and even the middle class who demanded que se vayan todos, or they all must go, all the members of the political class must go. And this ultimately resulted in 4 presidents resigning in less than 2 weeks in Argentina. And so there was a sector of the Brazilian bourgeoisie that took note of these concerning developments and began to place its hope in Lula, with the objective of co-opting union members and students and landless peasants to prevent more radicalized movements from developing.
Yeah, it's a pattern I feel like we see all over the world in capitalist states, that they try to channel discontent back into the institutions of the regime and channel discontent out of workplaces, out of the streets, and things like that.
Absolutely. And so, during Lula's and Dilma's terms, there were some modest reforms at the beginning, again in times of an economic boom, like the Bolsa Familia that made cash payments to the poorest families. However, the fundamental structures of Brazil's deeply unequal society remained in place. So, despite the promises of Lula and the expectations in his government, there was no meaningful land reform carried out. The majority of Brazil's productive land today remains in the hands of agribusiness and the large estate owners. To give just one stat, 1% of the population in Brazil owns about 50% of all the land. And meanwhile, there are more than 4.5 million landless peasants in the country. And beyond this, the PT never challenged um, international financial institutions, the relationship with U.S. imperialism. The PT governments continue to service the international debt at just enormous cost to the country's working people and poor. To give some idea, the amount that was paid annually to service the international debt was about 9 times the entire educational budget in the country. And, far from carrying out socialist measures, the PT was unwilling to deliver even basic democratic rights to many Brazilian people, like the right to an abortion. So, catering instead to the evangelicals rather than Brazilian people, poor people, women, etc. Both Lula and Dilma refused to legalize abortion, and abortion remains illegal today in Brazil. I think finally it's worth pointing out that Brazil sent the largest military contingent to Haiti as part of the MINUSTA troops. The largest contingent in the world happened under Lula. This was after the 2004 U.S.-backed coup against Aristide. And the legacy of this mission is just horrendous. Troops were responsible for introducing a cholera outbreak that killed over 10,000 people. And there were numerous reports of troops extorting women for sex in exchange for food and basic goods. And so all of this points to the unwillingness of the Lula and Dilma governments to challenge capitalism in Brazil and to challenge the dictates of international imperialism.
Fast forwarding then to this week, something that's been really concerning in terms of the election is that Bolsonaro and his supporters have kind of already been sowing the seeds for denying the election results. Like, he's pretty openly said he won't accept the results if he loses. He's also, I believe, questioned the reliability of voting machines and things like that. So really taking notes from Donald Trump's response to the 2020 elections for sure. So the media's been talking a lot about things like how maybe Bolsonaro is preparing for a coup, or some people will take it even further and say he's planning like a fascist takeover and things like that. Is it likely that this would actually happen? Like, should we be worried that something like a military coup could happen in Brazil?
I think at the moment we can say that a military coup or any real maneuvers to keep Lula from taking office are unlikely. The Biden administration has already expressed its expectation that election results will be respected. This doesn't in any way suggest that Biden or the Democratic Party are defenders of democracy. The White House, under both Democratic and Republican leadership, has a long and intense record of supporting military coups and dictatorships in Latin America. The Obama administration not only supported Operation Car Wash and the ouster of Dilma, as we talked about, but also the 2009 coup in Honduras and the 2012 institutional coup in Paraguay, to date just a few recent examples. But at the moment, with a unstable geopolitical situation, the ongoing war in Ukraine, the tensions between the United States and China, along with the domestic challenges for Biden. I think we could say that it's unlikely there's a contested election in Brazil, which of course is Latin America's largest economy. There have been various representatives of the Brazilian ruling class who've come out and called for a peaceful transition to the next administration. The major industrial organization in Brazil and the National Federation of Banks both put out a statement in quote unquote defense of democracy. And the Brazilian military ultimately takes its directives from US imperialism and from these national bourgeois federations. So it doesn't seem that there's a relationship of forces which would allow for a coup at the moment. Now, it is possible that Bolsonaro attempts to mobilize his reactionary social base like he did on September 7th, Brazil's Independence Day, calling on supporters to rally in the streets of Rio. And there's a possibility that he continues instilling distrust in the elections in order to secure his place as the leader of a far-right opposition, much the way Trump has in the US. But despite this, I think we can say that much of Bolsonaro's legacy is going to remain despite a Lula victory. As an example, the Supreme Court recently gave the armed forces the power to count the ballots following the elections. And so I think what this shows is that the military wishes and will continue to be a major actor in national politics in Brazil, even under an eventual Lula administration.
Yeah, I think Lula has also been surprisingly frank in recent interviews and debates and things like that about the fact that he's not really going to touch the really widespread privatization that Bolsonaro embarked on. And obviously, he doesn't have a particularly antagonistic relationship with agribusiness, even though he, claims that he is going to tackle deforestation and the environmental issues in Brazil. So it does sound, not just from any tea leaf reading or anything like that, or any leftist paranoia. I mean, it's coming pretty directly from the PT and from Lula and his obvious choices in cabinets and things like that, that his administration is going to be very similar in some ways, or in many ways rather, to Lula, or to Bolsonaro rather, and is going to continue many of the same policies that, as you said, I mean, are in some ways existential threats when it comes to the environment.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. Lula has made clear that he has no intention of overturning the privatizations or the attacks on working people that were enacted under the administration of Bolsonaro, like the attacks on labor laws, on pension rights. None of this will be reversed by Lula. And I think it's very telling that he has chosen this figure of Geraldo Alckmin as his vice presidential candidate. Alckmin was a member of the PSDB, which was the party that led Brazil in the 1990s during an intense period of neoliberalism. So choosing him as vice president is a clear sign of what's to come, I think. Now, in order to set himself apart from Bolsonaro, Lula has had to propose a few initiatives a few progressive initiatives, um, like the creation of a human rights ministry. So he's trying to create a progressive facade for himself. Um, but but ultimately, he's reiterated his record in paying off the debt to the IMF, and he's going to continue doing this if he's elected. This is a totally illegitimate debt that is really a vehicle for privatization, for cutbacks to public services like healthcare and education, um, and it's a just monumental transfer of wealth um, to finance capital and to imperialism abroad.
Yeah, absolutely. And although this is a little bit maybe beyond the scope of this conversation, I think it's also worth keeping in mind the global economic situation right now in terms of things like inflation, rising interest rates, and things like that. That it's also likely that a Lula government and the PT and other reformist or center left politicians will face a lot of pressure to implement things like further austerity and to further make sure that the working class bears the brunt of the various economic and social crises that Brazil is going through, but that also the rest of the world is going through at the moment.
Yeah, absolutely. It's it was one thing for Lula to enact again some modest reforms during um, a time of economic relative economic prosperity, but it's a totally different thing when um, Brazil has a serious inflationary crisis, just like uh, much of the world. That there's been a tremendous spike in poverty, um, a tremendous increase in hunger. About I think half of the population in Brazil is food insecure right now, and if I remember right, about 15% regularly goes hungry. So it's a dire situation, one that is completely different from the period in which Lula first took office. And Lula really has no response, no answer to these many crises that Brazil faces, from the cost of living to the public health crisis to the severe economic crisis, threats to indigenous people, black people, etc.
Yeah, hopefully it's clear to listeners that we do not believe that the left should throw its full weight of support behind Lula. I mean, although, as you said, it's important to denounce all of these really anti-democratic measures that Bolsonaro pulled, and the measures of the Lava Jato and the impeachment and things like that. It's definitely not the case that Lula is an option for leftists here. And we also, of course, for the reasons you gave in terms of Lula's legacy, we don't believe in like wearing rose tinted glasses when it comes to the first Lula presidency or Dilma Rousseff's government. But I want to end on a slightly more hopeful or optimistic note, because we obviously don't want to like throw up our hands in despair over the election on Sunday. So I'd love to hear a bit more about what the left should fight for in Brazil, and specifically, both leftists internationally, but also leftists in Brazil. I'd like to hear more about the MRT, or the Revolutionary Workers Movement, and what they are putting forward right now.
Yeah. So I think to begin, we have to have a perspective of protecting the few democratic rights that exist for Brazilian working people and the poor. And so this means defending against any anti-democratic maneuvers by Bolsonaro and his allies to retain the presidency. But this defense has to come through mobilizations in the streets and working class methods. It can't come through conciliation with big business, the landowners, neoliberal politicians like Gerardo Alckmin, as the PT and Lula intend. Now, the Party of Socialism and Liberty, or PSOL, which was to the left of the PT for many years, has put all of its forces toward Lula's election campaign. And as we've discussed, this really means cooperation with the Brazilian capitalists and the establishment, including most of the supporters of the 2016 institutional coup. And then, as you say, most of the international left, at least much of the international left, has taken a similar position to the PSOL, critically or uncritically backing Lula's candidacy. Jacobin today called Lula's presidency a cause for celebration. It's our perspective that the way out of these various crises is through the independent organization of the working class and especially oppressed Black Brazilians, women, indigenous people, LGBTQ people. And as you say, our comrades in the Revolutionary Workers Movement are fighting for this perspective and are putting forward their own candidates as part of a revolutionary poll together with other left-wing organizations like the United Socialist Workers Party, the PSTU, the Socialist Workers Current, the CST, along with unionists and activists and intellectuals. And the MRT has always said that, again, it's necessary to fight the far right, represented by Bolsonaro, but through class independence, through strikes, through mobilizations in the streets, and beyond that, to fight for all of the privatizations and counter reforms enacted by Bolsonaro to be overturned. And so, unlike the strategy put forward by the PT, our comrades believe that it's necessary for the capitalist class in Brazil to pay for this crisis, and not the working class, and that it's the working class that is really capable of providing a solution when it comes to protecting the environment, forests in Brazil, protecting indigenous people, the end of the oppression of Black people, women. All of this will come only through the organization of the working class, not through a trust in the PT.
Yeah, I think that's a super great way to end this. We'll definitely follow up on this election. And I want to say thank you so much, Rob. This was really, really informative. I learned a lot. And yeah, thank you so much for coming on the podcast yet again.
That's my pleasure as always. Thanks.